So before we start again with further questions for Mrs. James, you asked a question of me about the civil litigation obligations at the time of Mrs. James's first period at the DSS. It is right to simply point out that at that time no writs had been issued, and so litigation hadn't been formally commenced, so there were no formal court disclosure obligations at that time.
Thank you very much.
Mrs. James, I want to pick up then with your move to the Department of the Environment.
Yes.
At which point, obviously, you didn't have any day-to-day conduct of any of these issues.
Absolutely not, no.
But I think you are aware that there was an ongoing question of where the remaining HIV litigation files were.
Yes.
And on the 5th of June 1996, you had a call from a DHSS lawyer, Mark Wilson, who's also a friend.
Yes, that's correct.
And he passed a message on asking about some documents.
Yes.
Could we turn to WITN 5426092, please?
Oh.
Could you help help all of us with what this document is and what it shows?
Well, I wouldn't really class it as a document. It's in a habit that went back to my school days. I used to keep a rough notebook, and as you can see, I've written the date. So just to remind myself of what happened, maybe for future reference, I would write down what had happened. So there's what looks to be a brief summary of Mark Wilson's conversation with me. I don't know whose wage slip he was after. And then it says Jane's report. She was our office manager, and I had a duty to write her annual report. So that was obviously in progress, and he was inquiring about that. Then there looks to be a list of files.
And the code LGR, do you have any recollection of what that is? Or is it GR with a note, with like an arrow?
No, it's L.
LGR?
Yes.
Do you have any recollection of what the LGR code was?
They were solicitors' office files.
And for each of these references, are these an entire lever arch file or a document or a box? What is your recollection of what these are?
I don't recall using boxes in those days. I think these were just files.
And when you say they're just files, lever arch files, or
No,
sort
they were
of paper files?
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Go ahead.
They were a sort of card file and what's called treasury tags, which are shoelace type things that you thread through documents. And so the most recent document would be on top on one side, and then minutes, if you needed to write a note, I should say, they would be on the other side.
And so from this, is it right that Mark was passing on a message asking you about these particular files?
He must have been.
Do you recall what you then did about that and what happened?
No, I don't think I did anything, to be honest. I just noted that they were the missing files.
And did you check whether you had taken them or had them by mistake?
I certainly would not have taken them. I wouldn't have taken anything that belonged to DSS or DH to environment, other than my own personal bits and pieces, my wage slips or annual report notices.
Then in March 1999, you returned to the department as head of litigation.
That's correct.
What did that role entail?
I had overall oversight of all civil litigation relating to the Department of Health, the Department of Social Security, the Office of National Statistics, and the Food Standards Agency. So anything from personal injury cases, of which the Food Standards Agency had rather a lot, as did DSS, to judicial review, which is what my specialism was really, for both departments.
When you returned to the department,
Yes.
were you surprised that the hepatitis C litigation was still ongoing?
I don't think I was surprised. Litigation sometimes takes time.
We've heard evidence from Charles Lister
Yes.
already, and in your statement you've identified his submission to Lord Hunt, setting out the advice from the NHS Litigation Authority that had been given to the National Blood Authority that they should settle the
Yes.
hepatitis C litigation. I'd like to turn now to a fax that Charles Lister had sent to you, WITN 5426099. It's dated the 26th of July 1999, and it sets out that there was to be a meeting of the NBA board about the NHSLA advice,
Yes.
the litigation authority advice, and then this, paragraph 3. The NHSLA have asked for a decision on settling the litigation by the 6th of August. The rest of the board have agreed that Mike and, I think it's Jenny. Can act for them. We're not entirely sure how they'll wish to play tomorrow's meeting, but I guess that they will want to come to an agreed view by the end of it. We will then need to put a note to ministers to give them a chance to comment. This will need to address the wider policy implications of a settlement, which is something on which I would value your advice.
Yes.
And is that was that sort of the normal way of a policy official seeking advice from the lawyers?
I can't say there was any normal way. Sometimes they'd ring up, sometimes they'd write. So it could vary according to circumstances.
And then if we turn to WITN 5426103, please. We have a note dated the 9th of September 1999 to you, and you've identified this as a note coming from a member of your team.
Yes.
We see at number 3, under the heading hepatitis C litigation, number 3, undertake the collating exercise, and then C. Number
Yes.
4, usual line about taking instructions. Can you explain to us what's meant by number 3, undertake the collating exercise, and then C?
I suppose it means pulling everything together and then trying to come to a conclusion about what should be done.
And that would be collating documents
I
that
know,
were relevant.
at this stage, I can't exactly say, but it looks a bit like all sorts of things were being considered. For example, this see number 2, indivisibility of the Crown. So,
Is it your recollection that at this point there was a set of documents that had been pulled together from which you could advise?
no, I don't think there was.
So in September 1999, the documents were still somewhat diffuse.
Yes, I believe so.
And when we look at point 8, see no harm in assisting on basis of what's available. Again, can you help us with what's being referred to there?
No, I'm afraid not.
It might be suggested that that refers to assisting on the basis of what's available and what documents are available. But is that,
Yes, it could be seen as that.
do you have any recollection of whether that was what was being discussed?
No. I don't recognise the handwriting either, particularly. It obviously came from my bit of the office.
Is it fair to suggest that thereafter your involvement, your personal involvement, was relatively limited in the litigation, and the NHSLA were taking the lead on whether and how to settle the claims?
They all had their own lawyers, their own solicitors, so it was nothing to do with me, if you like.
You provided some advice to Charles Lister in relation to one point, which I do want to look at with you.
Yes, of course.
WITN 5426108, please. a minute from Charles Lister to Dr McGovern, dated the 12th of October 1999.
Yes.
And if we look at paragraph 3, there's a discussion about settling the litigation. Paragraph 3 says this: when I spoke to Anita James, her view was that ministers could be criticised if we make those who've not yet sued us sue us. She thought that the non-litigants might even try to get the decision to exclude them from the settlement judicially reviewed on the basis that no reasonable Secretary of State properly appraised of the situation would exclude them.
Yes.
Do you recall anything more of what you advised Mr Lister in regard to this?
No, I'm afraid not.
And do you recall how your advice on this point was perceived by those to whom you were giving it?
I can't say what they thought, no.
Did you have any sense, any reaction from them or any discussion with them about your views?
No.
I want to then pick up the issue of documents again. In
Yes.
November 1999, the claimants in the litigation served an application for third-party disclosure
Yes.
on the department. For those listening who aren't lawyers, that meant that although you weren't a party to the litigation, you were being asked to find and provide documents. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes.
Then can we turn to WITN 5426132? This is dated the 22nd of November 1999.
Yes.
It's a message to you with the subject Dr Mehta's whereabouts, and you're told that the date of birth still shows him with an address in RH.
It's DOB stands for distribution of business.
Ah, thank you. So the distribution of business still shows him with an
Yes.
address in RH. I think he had to move rooms. So in November 1999, you were asking about Dr Mehta's whereabouts. Is that right?
Yes.
And that was because of his role chairing the ACVSB.
Yes, and as Deputy Chief Medical Officer.
So it was part of the reason you were looking for him to see whether he had any of the papers that were missing.
Exactly.
Why hadn't he been found much earlier when the GEB file was identified as missing?
I don't know.
Then if we turn to WITN 5426133. We have your message to Dr Mehta's, and you say this: I do not have skeletons in my cupboards, just old files. One has come back to haunt me, hepatitis C. What did you mean by that phrase?
I suppose it's a little bit flippant and I apologise for that, but the fact of the matter was I didn't really expect, although it's slightly in contradiction to what I've just said to you, I didn't really expect to have to deal with hepatitis C after all that time.
And then it sets out at paragraph 2, the department is not actually being sued, but DS Mallon Suter, on behalf of their claimants, intend to apply for disclosure of the department's records for a period between the 1st of March 1988 and the 1st of September 1991. Rather than risk the inevitable order for costs, we're going to consent to the application. I understand from Yvonne de Sampaio that she has no records on the subject beyond 1997. I think you flagged in your witness statement that you meant before 1997.
That's correct, that's a mistake.
I wondered if you, by chance, had kept any of the records yourself, even if you haven't kept the documents. If there are no suitable copies in HSD under the rules, I have to specify the documents which are no longer in the department's control.
Yes.
So that's a reference to the need to either provide the documents or confirm formally that they aren't under the department's control.
That's correct.
We then have a further email from you to Mr Lister, WITN 5426134. Sorry, sir, just let me... Sorry, 136, apologies. We have the reply from Dr. Metters halfway down the page. Thank you for your minute regarding the legal request for disclosure of papers on hepatitis C. I no longer have any papers on the subject, as all my files were passed on to Pat Troop when I retired as DCMO. However, as legal action against the department on hepatitis C had long been regarded as a possibility, I retained more papers on this subject than on most topics. These include copies of the minutes of ACVSB, the relevant advisory committee at the time, and some of the papers that ACVSB had considered. I did not have a full set of the latter. And then Dr. Metters gives you further sources of where the documents might be.
Yes.
So at this time in November 1999, what was your understanding of where these documents were?
Well, I thought they were actually in Dr. Metters' old office. I do recall visiting him in the 1990s, early 1990s that is, and he had a sort of walk-in cupboard, you might say, full of stuff. And I thought that they were the documents I was looking for.
So you said just a moment ago that you visited him in the early 1990s.
Yes.
Was that related to the hepatitis C litigation, or was it something else?
The back of my mind, I think, I don't know, I seem to recall it was to do with BSE.
Given that in the earlier 90s you were aware of his cupboard of documents,
Yes.
when you were seeking to assess the position of the department's vulnerability,
Yes.
do you have any recollection of why you didn't go to Dr. Metters at that point and say, I think you've got a cupboard of documents, please can I have them?
No, I think I was looking for the registered files.
Could we then turn to WITN 5426139, please? It's a message from you to Mr. Lister of the 29th of November 1999. There was a discussion about the date by which documents had to be disclosed, and then you said this: Dr. Metters says he left all his papers with his successor. It would appear that they've been shredded because they represented an inconvenience. If you can replicate them, I won't hold a post-mortem. How did you come to say that all the papers had been shredded because they represented an inconvenience?
I spoke to Yvonne de Sampaio and asked her where the documents were, and she told me that she had got rid of them.
That phrase, representing an inconvenience, what did you mean by that? Or
well, I know in my it's recorded that she'd had a lot of trouble with disclosure in relation to BSE, and I have no recollection of that specifically being mentioned. But my impression now is that the documents did represent an inconvenience to her, and that's why she got rid of them.
I just want to turn to two witness statements that the inquiry has received. One
Yes.
from Ms. de Sampaio and one
Yes.
from Dr. Patricia Troop, and then ask you about them if I may.
Of course, please.
It might be useful to have it on screen. WITN 7914001, which is the statement of Yvonne de Sampaio. Page 15, please. It's a relatively lengthy section I want to read, Mrs. James, and I
Yes.
also want to read Dr. Troop's statement before I ask you a question.
Okay.
I do not recall the conversation that Anita James referred to in her instructions to counsel. That's something we'll come to in a moment. Nor can I remember any other conversations regarding the location and or destruction of Dr. Metters' private papers. I was particularly shocked to see reference to the suggestion that I destroyed documents because I was fearful of a difficult disclosure process due to a supposed bad experience with the BSE inquiry's disclosure process. It's not in my character to speak about work in this way, and I certainly wouldn't destroy documents for this reason. I've always prided myself on doing things by the book and carefully following any instructions given. In fact, as set out at paragraph 8 above, I was not involved in the BSE disclosure process and would not therefore be in a position to pass comment on the difficulty of it. In fact, I didn't destroy any of Dr. Mehta's private files, nor was I asked to do so by any senior staff. I understand that any private papers left by Dr. Mehta's would have remained in situ in the office following his retirement. In my experience, it was standard process for all papers held on behalf of a DCMO to go to the individual taking over the role. There was no process of reviewing files following a DCMO's departure. In practice, this would just mean that the papers remained in the DCMO office's cabinets. By way of context, my work with both Dr. Mehta's and Dr. Troop, and at DH more generally, was of a purely administrative kind, managing diaries and performing day-to-day secretarial tasks, such as typing, stenographing, filing private papers and scheduling meetings. It was not within my remit to make decisions about the retention of files registered or otherwise. As such, if I were to dispose of any files, which I don't recall doing, I would have obtained prior permission from a superior as a matter of course. And then if we can turn to WITN 7169001, please. At page 15. This is the statement of Dr. Patricia Troop, and she says this: Mrs. de Sampaio was my private secretary for 5 years, and in my experience was very thorough when implementing civil service procedures. I worked with her very closely, and I do not think she would have done anything improper. Therefore, I find it very hard to believe the account that she destroyed documents because a previous investigation had caused her difficulty. I do not know what she would have meant by these comments. I do not recall her talking to me about her difficulties with the BSE inquiry. After Dr. Mehta's left, I did see her clearing out papers which she thought were from Dr. Mehta's time. However, I didn't find it unusual, since she would have wanted to start afresh and make space for a new DCMO coming into the office.
Yes.
Do you have any response that you want to make to either Ms. de Sampaio's statement or Dr. Troop's?
Well, all I can say is that I was quite pleased that I remembered the documents were there, and very disappointed when I learnt that they weren't. And they definitely disappeared. And I'm absolutely clear that Mrs. de Sampaio told me that she had destroyed them. And that seems to be corroborated to a certain extent, but not as to motivation, by what Dr. Troop says.
If we can, I'm happy to put it back up on the screen if we need to. Just go back to the message that you sent to Mr. Lister, where you said, if you can replicate them, I won't hold a post-mortem.
Yes.
Why did you decide not to hold a post-mortem?
Well, I can't say really. I just thought that it would be best to move on and get on with the litigation.
Did you take any steps at that time to address the fact that on the information you had been given, papers had been shredded that shouldn't have been?
Not in 1999, no.
And why was that?
Things hadn't come to a head.
Sorry?
Things hadn't come to a head.
In what way?
In terms of deciding on disclosure and that sort of thing. I just was looking for documents.
So what would have been a trigger for you to investigate?
Well, I'm not sure that it was for me to investigate, because she was, that is, Yvonne de Sampaio, was Dr. Troop's responsibility and not mine. And if she had done anything wrong, it would have been for her to sort things out. And I didn't go to Dr. Troop, if that's what's being asked. But no, I just didn't think I wanted to make a fuss about it with her.
If we can then turn to WITN 5426140, please. We have an email from Mr. Lister to you.
Yes.
Anita, I found 5 volumes of relevant papers from an earlier discovery exercise labelled volumes 1 to 4 and volume 6, so at least one volume has still to be found. These contain papers from January 1987 to November 1991, with some earlier and later material. There is a gap in the record between June 1988 and April 1989, which may be included in the missing volume. On the basis of a quick read-through, there are clearly some papers missing from 1990-1991, most notably records of discussions at the Advisory Committee on Virological Safety of Blood.
Right.
Otherwise, what we have tells a fairly complete story.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, it would appear that volume 5 is still missing at this stage.
Yes.
But you and Mr. Lister are seeking to find files.
No.
And then if we turn to WITN 5426141, we have a message from Mike McGovern to Charles Lister with you CC'd, saying, I know Mal and Sue to have the committee papers for this period, as I had already gone through them for Sarah Campbell. It was a complete set stamped with NBS, all in a very large folder, so I'm sure it's a copy held by Sol. You were CC'd into this email, this
Yes.
message. What did you do about this message suggesting that Sol held a copy of the committee papers?
I can't remember.
Did you set in train a search within Sol for a thorough search of documents that might be held by Sol?
Not at that stage, no.
Then if we turn to WITN 5426144, it's a message from you to Mr. Lister. Thank you for letting me see the records. We agreed you'll see if there are any more records covering the gap. I suggested you might inquire if there's a basement at Eileen House where documents might be. You also told me that John Canavan was still around, so he may know what might be where. You agreed to recall certain old files from remote storage and speak to Mike McGovern about the files I brought over. I said I'd like the papers sent over here. What were the files that you had taken over there?
I'm afraid I just can't remember, but I know we were looking, at that stage we were looking everywhere for papers, relevant papers.
And then we have an email, WITN 5426145.
Yes.
From Mr. Lister to you. Second paragraph. It's dated the 8th of December 1999.
Yes.
I've spoken to John Canavan, who turns out, happy coincidence this, to be the person currently responsible for the Hepatitis C Advisory Group. His recollection is that all the relevant discussions about HCV and blood transfusion took place at the ACVSB. For now, Mrs. James, I just want to note the date of this document and we'll come back to it in a moment, but to keep it in the chronology,
Yes.
just to highlight it there. And then if we carry on, WITN 5426155. An email from you to Mr. Lister on the 6th of January 2000. Between Christmas and New Year, I went through the files you sent over and they look reasonably complete. However, there are some gaps. For example, in October 1989, there was a handwritten request from Graham Hart, then the grade 2, I think, asking John James to do some costings on the test for HCV. John recalls asking for the work to be done, but not surprisingly, what was said? I think the answer must lie in the registered files, the list for which you showed me. Can you retrieve the files now? So can you help us, Mrs. James, with this?
Yes.
Is it right that as at the 6th of January 2000, some registered files had not yet been retrieved.
It looks like it, yes.
Do you have any recollection of why that was?
No. Not at this stage.
Given the importance of registered files,
Yes.
how important were they in tracking down documents? Would they not have been one of the first places to look?
Maybe, yes.
We then have an email from Gwen Skinner, WITN 5426157. And I'm going to just read this message to you, read this message out and look at your reply before I ask you about it.
Yes.
She wrote this: I should be grateful for clarification of the full extent of what we need to do in the discovery of files/papers for the HCV litigation. We've ordered all the files which belong to the blood section between January 1989 and September 1991, and which seem possibly relevant, plus the files on the manuscript list drawn up in 1997, which you've seen. I understand, though, that the manuscript list is only part of a longer list, and we haven't been able to trace the remainder. Many of the files on that list belonged to sections other than the blood section, so it's not possible for us to work out the missing files. Do we need to ask the file registry to search their records for all files which might have relevance? The titles are not likely to indicate the detail of the contents in many cases. And then picking up your reply, WITN 5426158. You say this: if I can be put in a position to explain why the files are missing, and it's for a good reason, I can argue that it would be disproportionate to pursue the matter further. At the moment, just concentrate on the list you have. First of all, at the time of your response, were you clear as to what documents were still missing?
Well, if they were missing, I wouldn't know what they were, but I was determined to find as many relevant documents as we could.
The email from Gwen Skinner suggested that some files might be with other sections, not with blood policy.
Yes.
Did you have any clarity over which documents might be with other departments?
Other parts of Department
Other
of
parts
Health.
of Department of Health, apologies, other teams.
Well, no, I mean, I think you can discover which bits of the department would have had input. For example, I mentioned John James. He was head of finance, so he would have been doing cost-benefit analysis of what of the consequences of settling and things like that. So you can work out where you might find relevant files. There'll be possibly files in private office, possibly in other places as well, but it is possible to sort of work your way through.
This email to Gwen Skinner suggests that you're not asking her to do any systematic assessment of where else files might be. Is that fair?
Yes, I can't really remember what she did, and I certainly didn't know her, and I have no vision of what she looked like, so I really wouldn't have expected her to set to and do it.
Did you or one of your team sit down and do a systematic assessment of where files might be?
No.
Did you or one of your team take steps to even just blanket message out to other teams to say, have you got any files?
Well, we looked in all the places we thought of, but no, there was no sort of blanket.
So would it be fair to suggest that the searches that were undertaken were more ad hoc, things that you thought of, rather than an analytical assessment?
I wouldn't agree that they were ad hoc. I would say there was more analysis to it than you think. But we certainly didn't put out a blanket notice, was everybody in the Department of Health, please start looking.
And I think earlier you also indicated to me that there wasn't a moment where you or your team sat down and did a systematic assessment of where files might be.
No, I was working it out with Charles Lister.
If we could then turn to WITN 5426164, please. This is an email from you to Mr. Canavan, dated
Yes.
the 21st of January 2000.
Yes.
John, I meant to get in touch with you before now, but it slipped my mind. Charles Lister may have told you that we are required to make non-party discovery in relation to the ongoing hepatitis C litigation. The list of documents DMS wants includes the minutes on the advisory group on hepatitis. The dates concerned are between the 1st of March 1988 and the 1st of September 1999. The information about John Canavan had been given to you by Mr. Lister on the 8th of December 1999. It was the document we looked at a moment ago. Why was there such a... Why did it take until the 21st of January before you made the request for documents?
I don't know. I'd obviously been around. I do of course, it was the millennium. And we had a much longer holiday as a consequence of that. I do remember now I had flu at the time of the millennium. And that may be the reason why there was the delay. You said 1999, 1st of September 1999. It's 1991, in fact.
Oh, apologies, let me... Sorry, the original message that Charles Lister had told you about Mr. Canavan was December 1999.
Oh, I beg your pardon, I misheard. Yes.
We then have Mr. Canavan's response, WITN 5426166. And he informs you, we're getting the necessary files back from the store at Nelson and hope to let you have the AGH minutes in the middle of this week. They may contain little, if anything, about Hep C in the blood supply, as this came within the ACVSB remit from 1989. So this is addressing the advisory group on hepatitis.
Yes.
Is it right that as of January 2000, the minutes of that group are only then being sought from the remote storage?
Yes, I don't think I was aware that they were there. And John Canavan was perfectly placed. He'd been around, very experienced person for a long time, and I'd worked with him in the past on policy things, not litigation. So I knew that he was really a fount of knowledge.
Given he was such a fount of knowledge, can you assist with why he hadn't been contacted earlier for documents and information?
Well, I didn't know where he was. I remember him leaving the department as a result of the reorganisation in the early 90s.
Mr. Canavan provided you with a note indicating that he had the files.
Yes.
And that there were very few references to hepatitis C.
Yes.
And he said, please let me know if you need anything else, and they'll hold on to the files for some time. From your reply, it doesn't appear that you asked to look at the files themselves.
No.
Why was that?
Well, I didn't see the need to do it, I suppose. This was just one case I had on my books. I'm not suggesting that as an excuse, but I had to prioritise my work, and he had them safe under his control.
If we could then turn to WITN 5426171, please. We can see here that DMS wrote to you, pointing out a large number of gaps in the documents.
Yes.
and the letter carries on over some 3 pages, setting out what's missing. There are some annotations on this letter, and if we could just go up, we can see some handwriting there. Do you know whose handwriting that is?
No, I don't recognise it.
We can see that the note, Welsh office destroyed.
Yes.
Can you help us with why that was written there?
Well, because I don't recognise the handwriting and I don't know who the author was. No, but I assume whoever wrote it had inquired of the Welsh office as to whether they had any documents, and the answer came back that they didn't.
Do you recall tasking anyone with that, checking with the Welsh office?
No, I don't recall asking anybody in particular. It would have been someone in my office.
And then if we can turn to WITN 5426198. It's a message from Mr. Lister to you.
Yes.
And it's dated the 25th of February 2000.
Yes.
There are a couple of existing members of MSBT who were on ACVSB in the late 80s, early 90s, including Angela Robinson of NBA. It may be that they've kept copies of old papers, and we're going to check up on this. It'll be embarrassing, but not as bad as telling DMS we haven't got them. Meanwhile, I'll find out what I can about the destroyed files.
Yes.
So, as of February 2000, Mr. Lister is only then going back to old members of the committee.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think you had advised him to go back to those? Was this a? Sorry, let me rephrase that scrambled question. It's February 2000, and he's just going back to old members of the committee.
Yes.
Why hadn't you advised him to do that at an earlier stage?
I don't know.
And then if we turn to WITN 5426 200. It's a message from Mr. Lister to Sandra Faulkner. Thanks for agreeing to help with this. I've obtained a number of the missing papers from Prof. Zuckerman, but his record is incomplete and doesn't include either the 4th or 14th minutes, which you were looking for. Sadly, we can't help with these either. Our copy of the 4th meeting minutes has pages missing, and we don't have the 14th at all. If I can track them down, I'll let you have a copy. The other papers I still need to find are, and he sets them out. So from this, it appears that Mr. Lister was contacting Ms. Faulkner of the Scottish Executive.
Well, thank you. I couldn't remember where she was.
Again, why had there not been contact with the Scottish Executive at an earlier stage?
I'm afraid I don't know.
You said earlier that there wasn't a time when you or your team sat down and systematically assessed where documents might be.
Mm-hmm.
With the benefit of hindsight, do you think that that might have been an exercise that would have been worthwhile?
I'm not convinced that it was. Would have been, I should say. We were making some progress in finding documents in the way we were tackling it.
Had there been a more systematic assessment, perhaps at an earlier stage, again, I recognise with the benefit of hindsight, do you think further documents might have been found that weren't?
I fear not.
Why do you say that?
Passage of time.
And with the passage of time, what would you be concerned has happened?
That people who had been involved, their memories had faded. I mean, I do remember Professor Zuckerman, and he was very helpful. The alternative scenario is that documents had been destroyed because they weren't considered relevant, because they weren't on registered files, that sort of thing. Instructions
were then sent to Justin Fenwick QC, and I'd just like to look at one part of it. DHSC 20 46972 _131. You can turn to page 3. We can see here instructions that you prepared, paragraph 5. When DMS first intimated that they were going to seek disclosure, your instructing solicitor approached Dr. Mehta's former secretary, Yvonne de Sampaio, who now works for Dr. Pat Troop, the current Deputy Chief Medical Officer / Public Health. Quite to the incredulity of Mrs. James, Mr. Sampaio told her that she had destroyed the documents because the BSE disclosure process, I think I should say, had caused her great difficulty. Dr. Mehta's records are therefore not available. I've been asked to ask you what your response would be to the suggestion that this account of what you understood Mr. Sampaio to have done is somewhat different to the earlier emails where you referred to them as being destroyed as an inconvenience, and whether you were sugar-coating the incident when sending instructions to counsel.
I fully understand why you're asking the question. I don't now remember her saying to me it was because of difficulties with BSE. It was certainly not something I made up or sugar-coated.
You then had a conference with Justin Fenwick, and the inquiries heard evidence from him.
Yes, I know.
After which you prepared a draft minute to the Permanent Secretary about the issues. Could we turn that up? WITN 5426205, please. You introduce it by indicating that you're writing to let them know of a potential problem in relation to the disclosure of documents relating to hepatitis C.
Yes.
Then if we turn over the page, we see this. At a time in the mid-1990s when the department thought it was going to be a major party in litigation, counsel Justin Fenwick QC advised us to be prepared. Dr. Raymond, who was experienced in other discovery exercises, extracted relevant documents from the files. The files were kept in the Department of Health until February 2000, when they were disclosed to D.S. Malan Suter, who acted for the claimants. At this point, and picked up, I'm afraid to say, by DMS, it became apparent that the documents were incomplete. Anita James, who took over conduct of the case in June 1999, was aware of another source of documents. To that end, she had telephoned Dr. Mehta's former secretary, he having retired, to ask for Dr. Mehta's papers, which she'd seen when she was previously in sole litigation. Mr. Sampaio had had a clear-out when Dr. Mehta's retired. Dr. Mehta's had been chairman of the committee, which had looked into the adequacy of the tests and given final advice on their introduction in 1991. When DMS came back to the department about the gaps in disclosure, Charles Lister sought to retrieve the registered files for the period covered by the disclosure. He'd been informed by those at remote storage that the files have been destroyed. They were apparently marked for destruction at an early stage. 3 issues here. The documents Dr. Raymond had extracted were incomplete.
Yes.
Dr. Mehta's files had been destroyed.
Yes.
And some registered files had been destroyed.
So
is that right?
Yes.
If we carry on, counsel questioned Mrs. James. Sorry, paragraph 7. Counsel questioned Mrs. James and Mr. Lister as to how they knew the documents had been destroyed. I gather he was rather incredulous about the matter. What do you recall of Mr. Fenwick's incredulity at the conference?
Well, I remember being in his chambers and where I was, and the fact that, strangely, that I was sitting on his left-hand side. But what I don't remember is Charles Lister being there, but he undoubtedly was. And Justin Fenwick, you see, didn't show any sign of being incredulous in that he didn't pull faces or anything like that. But he was plainly surprised. And, of course, he had always emphasised how important it was to hang on to documents, so I guess he wasn't too pleased about it.
You then note the potential embarrassment and the possible need to pay more to settle the claims. And then we pick up at paragraph 9. Counsel was also of the view that there should be a small investigation into the destruction of the documents.
Yes.
He thought it should be done in-house and should not by any means take on the characteristics of a public inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
At this stage, what was your view of the state of the documents that you were dealing with?
That they were incomplete, and they were incomplete because there had been destruction, whether deliberate or not.
We see here that the small investigation into the destruction of the documents shouldn't by any means take on the characteristics of a public inquiry.
Yes.
I just want to unpack that a little bit further with you. Without the proper complete set of documents, were you in a position to say whether or not the actions of the department had been correct or not?
Me personally?
To advise the department on whether they were at any risk?
Well, I think to a certain extent, but further investigation was needed.
In those circumstances, was any consideration given to the need for a much more substantial inquiry?
I'll be frank with you, I didn't particularly know what to do. And that's why I went to Justin Fenwick QC, because he was incredibly brainy, not to put too fine a point on it. And I thought he would bring some insight into the way forward, which in fact he did. And I thought his recommendation was perfectly reasonable.
Just unpacking that a little further, you say you weren't sure what to do. What were your concerns?
Well, I knew that the department was in difficulties and that what had happened was embarrassing and would attract adverse publicity and had the potential for compromising the litigation. And none of that could be hidden. I was convinced of that.
We then pick up the rest of paragraph 9, dealing with the more specifics of the investigation. The investigator should interview Dr. Metters, Mr. Sampaio, the person at DH who signed the destruction authorisation, whom we know to be still at DH, and Dr. Raymond. The investigator should then report on that and make recommendations about such matters in the future.
Yes.
Counsel was of the view that as part of the investigation, Hayward stores should be visited. In this way, the department would have audited what has happened.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The person who you believe to still be at the Department of Health was Mr. Burridge?
Absolutely. I was still under that mistaken belief. That he was responsible, I should say.
And we'll come to the investigation in a moment.
Right.
But we have the list there of the people who Justin Fenwick considered should be interviewed during that process. He also highlights that as part of the investigation, Hayward stores should be visited.
Yes.
Was that something that you addressed?
No, I have actually been to Hayward stores, but not in the context of this.
So, given Mr. Fenwick's advice to make sure that it was visited,
yes,
whose responsibility was it to arrange that?
I took it to be the person who was doing the investigation.
Then paragraph 10, may I reassure you that this appears to be a one-off case. Sol Litigation has handled 3 other major writ actions of this kind and will undoubtedly handle others. They've no experience of this happening. Indeed, Mrs. James does not recall it happening in any other case.
Yes.
Can you assist the inquiry at all about why it happened in this case?
As opposed to not happening in any
others?
I think because people didn't understand the significance of what they were handling, the documents they were handling, and didn't give any thought in to the possibility of litigation, and were not steered in the direction of thinking about litigation, compounded by the fact that the department had undergone extraordinary upheaval, where a lot of the, what might call history had gone because the people who knew it had gone to other places and been dispersed and were no longer interested. I don't mean that they were deliberately not being interested, but they were no longer interested parties in the Department of Health.
So in some senses, are you saying that the corporate memory of the issues wasn't as strong as it might have been?
You've put it much better than I just did, and that's correct.
We will come to the investigation report shortly, but I want to try and stay in the chronology, if I may. If we could turn to WITN 5426209, please. Just before this minute of Mr. Lister to Dr. Troop,
Yes.
Mr. Lister had written to you confirming a discussion you'd had with him,
Yes.
that Pat Troop should be told about the documents issue.
Absolutely.
And that was because the memo to the Permanent Secretary was due to be sent up shortly.
Yes.
We then have the memo from Mr. Lister to Dr. Troop, and we pick it up in paragraph 3. A discovery exercise was undertaken by the department between 1995 and 1997. These documents have now been indexed and given to DMS. However, some important documents are missing, mostly papers and minutes of the Advisory Committee on Virological Safety of Blood, ACVSB, MSBT's earlier incarnation. We established a week ago that a number of the department's registered files containing ACVSB papers were sent for destruction, apparently in 1993, although the file store tell us that the actual destruction dates were between 1994 and 1998. This should not have happened, and we haven't yet got to the bottom of why this decision was taken. So this was destruction that had happened subsequently to the GEB4 files.
Yes.
And 4, Sol Litigation have consulted counsel today on the best way of handling the situation, and Mr. Fenwick's advice is then set out.
Yes.
And we go over a page. At the end of paragraph 5, I understand that Marilyn Morgan's minute will also refer to the destruction of Dr. Mehta's personal papers on ACVSB, which Sol Litigation took place shortly after his retirement.
Yes.
Although these papers were not on registered files, the implication may be that their destruction was ill-advised.
Yes.
This memo to Dr. Troop didn't make any specific reference to the fact that that destruction had been by, as you understood it, by her current personal assistant.
Yes.
Why was that?
Well, I didn't write the minutes, so I don't know.
Did you have any discussion with Mr. Lister about whether
I didn't.
that should be flagged up?
No, I didn't see it in draft.
And then on the 8th of March 2000, you've provided us with another note from your diary of a further conversation with Mr. Sampaio.
Yes.
It's probably worth turning it up. WITN 5426220. And it's the right-hand page of the
Yes.
diary. ACBS, after second meeting, subsequent, clear out which Dr. Mehta's left, given not registered files.
Yes.
Sorry, when Dr. Mehta's left, given not registered files.
Yes.
Could you help us again with what this note is?
It's a note of a conversation with Yvonne de Sampaio.
And you've noted there that the clear out was when Dr. Mehta's left, given they were not registered files.
Yes.
What's that referring to?
That's what she told me on that occasion.
Did that make sense to you as something that was logical, that because they weren't registered files, they'd been cleared out?
No, it didn't make sense.
Why not?
because they were still the departmental papers, even though they weren't on registered files.
So what would you have expected to have happened to Dr. Mehta's papers after he retired?
Well, he could have taken them with him, but since he no longer had responsibility for that area of business, then he left them, for, as he said, for his successor.
So where would you have expected to find them, given that he'd left them there?
In the same cupboard that I saw them in. And if they had been cleared out, then put somewhere safe.
Subsequently, Mr. Sampaio did identify a handful of documents and sent them across to you.
Yes.
Just for the transcript, your diary entry for that is WITN 5426224. You then wrote to the solicitors for the claimant.
Yes.
And if we can pick up at WITN 5426222. The second paragraph. I'm able to supply you with some of the papers which you called for in your letter dated the 27th of January 2000. That was the long list of things that were missing, is that right?
Yes.
A list of those documents and the documents themselves is attached. I cannot yet supply the documents listed in Annex A. It's difficult for me to offer anything other than a fairly bald statement as to what happened and why at this stage. As you may know, all departmental documents are kept on registered files. Once these files are no longer current, they are sent to remote storage. In the Department of Health's case, this is at Nelson, Lancashire. Before any documents go to Nelson, they're given a destruction or review date. I generally mark my files, bearing in mind they are generally completed cases, with a 10-year destruction date. Policy files, I understand, generally have a 20-year destruction date. In the case of the registered files containing the minutes of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, for reasons which we do not yet know, they were given an early destruction date and destroyed, as I understand it, between 1995 and 1997. We thought there were backup documents held by the chairman of the ACVSB. However, when he retired in the summer of 1999, there was a clear out of his papers, given that they were not registered files. We are seriously contemplating making a more detailed investigation in the matter. So that was your response to the claimants as to what had happened.
Yes.
They then replied, WITN 5426230. Point 1. Your letter of the 6th of March 2000 explained that the relevance of the department's documents was determined by Dr. Raymond, who had extensive experience of discovery procedures. Would you please confirm that when Dr. Raymond was considering the documents to be produced, he expressly put his mind to the test for standard disclosure set out in CPR Rule 31.6b 1 to 3, rather than the old test in RSC Order 24 Rule 2? Dr. Raymond is not a lawyer, and it's possible, we put it no higher at this stage, that whilst experienced in the obligations of discovery, he was unaware of the radical changes introduced in the 26th of April 1999. What consideration did you give to that question?
Well, I obviously read the letter, but given that Dr. Raymond had retired well before the civil procedure rules changed, then I didn't consider it any further.
We spoke earlier about that exercise by
Yes,
Dr. Raymond being a quick look, was my phrase.
Yes.
Did anyone go back to those GEB files that he'd filleted and the other files he'd worked through to take another look to make sure that everything that should have been disclosed had been disclosed? Subject to those that were missing, of course. Subject, of course, to the files that by then had gone missing.
I can't remember.
Did this question from the claimants in 2000 cause you to pause at all and assess whether there had been a full enough search for documents?
Well, we were looking, as I said, everywhere we could possibly think of to find documents. So short of, I don't know, we could have gone on forever, I suppose, but we really turned our minds to it and were looking hard for everything.
You then responded to DMS and they replied to you. If I can pick up their reply, WITN 5426236. Thank you for your letter of March 2000. We note that the person who had primary responsibility for identifying which of the department's documents should be disclosed is no longer employed and will not be completing a disclosure statement. This concerns us. It's of paramount importance that the entirety of the department's documents are reviewed by a solicitor familiar with the test for standard disclosure. Please identify who that would be. Again, receiving this letter again, do you recall if anybody, you or one of your team, went back to the documents that Dr. Raymond had briefly looked at to assess whether indeed everything relevant had been provided?
I certainly didn't, and I don't think anyone else in my office did.
For the transcript, the reference is WITN 5426239. There's a memo to you indicating that Justin Fenwick had returned some papers.
Yes, he had loads of papers in his chambers which weren't terribly in good order, in that they were stacked up against the walls and things like that. But being Justin Fenwick, you see, he knew exactly where everything was, and he looked and found stuff for us.
And that allowed you to fill some of the gaps?
Yes, it did.
I want to then turn to the internal investigation, but
Yes.
Sarah, I note the time. I've probably, Counsel's famous last words, I've probably got about 10 minutes before I complete my questions. But I don't know whether you trust my time estimates, sir.
Well, I'm prepared to give it a try. So let me just ask Mrs. James.
Yes.
Mrs. James, are you happy to continue for another 10 minutes or thereabouts?
Absolutely so, yes.
There will be a later session, but
No, I understand that.
and let's go ahead and see.
I want to just turn to the internal investigation
Yes.
about the documents' destruction. Could we turn to WITN 5426240, please? It's a minute from Dr. Troop.
Yes,
You're not copied into it, but I think you're aware of the document.
I am aware of the document, yes.
She wrote this: Bill Burley and his colleagues are carrying out an audit. That's the internal audit team.
Correct.
To ensure that we learn the lessons from this to avoid a further recurrence, they'll be trying to establish what happened and identify the extent to which procedures have not been followed. I've also asked them to review the action that's been taken to retrieve the files. And then point 5, the audit will not seek to apportion blame, rather help prevent such things happening again. So the audit investigation into the loss of documents
Yes.
is being set up.
Yes.
Then if we turn to WITN 5426242. We have the terms of reference for the audit, and if we go down to point 2, we have the heading Scope of Investigation. Broadly, internal audit has been asked to establish what happened, identify the extent to which procedures have not been followed, and make recommendations to prevent such incidents from occurring again. The extent of the investigation will depend on our initial understanding of the facts, but as a minimum we will need to talk to the following people: Dr. Raymond, Dr. Metters and his former secretary, and the person who authorised the destruction of the documents. We will need to identify the lessons from this case and the best way to communicate these, A, to HSD1, where we have specific recommendations, and B, to the wider department, where there are recommendations of a general nature. Internal audit will not seek to apportion any blame. The purpose of the review is to help prevent such things from happening again. Did you have any involvement in the setting of the terms of reference?
No.
Were you involved in any discussions about the purpose of the audit not being to apportion any blame?
No.
And were you involved at all in deciding who would be interviewed, other than passing on the information from Mr. Fenwick?
No.
We then have the report, WITN 5426245. We see it's dated the April 2000.
Yes.
And if we could turn to page 4, please. We have an overall conclusion at paragraph 3.1. We concluded that an arbitrary and unjustified decision, most likely taken by an inexperienced member of staff, was responsible for the destruction of a series of files containing the minutes and background papers of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. Did you ever probe that conclusion with anyone?
No, I didn't. I wasn't the person commissioning the report. I was, if you like, a client receiving the report. So no, I didn't probe it.
Did you explore with anyone why it was said that this was done by a junior staff member and how they'd reached that conclusion?
No, but it was at the back of my mind that I thought it must be a junior member of staff. No disrespect to Mr. Burridge, but he would have been in that category. So when I was thinking about who did it, he came to mind. I thought, so I'm not surprised it said a junior member of staff.
Did you
An inexperienced member of staff, rather.
Why was that your view? Why did you think it would be?
Because I thought it would be someone who didn't know the significance of the files.
Is it a fair reading of the report that it's essentially an assumption that it's somebody junior?
It is an assumption, yes, but whether it's a reasonable assumption, I thought it was.
And, sir, for your note, we have a statement from Lawrence George, who undertook the audit report. The reference is WITN 6963001. WITN 6963001, and he sets out that it was essentially an assumption.
Well, it's plainly an assumption.
Yes, indeed. Sorry, sir.
The issue is whether it's a justified one.
Yes.
Indeed. I think that's a question that you can't assist us with, Mrs. James.
No, I think it's for Lawrence George to be questioned about.
Throughout the report, names are not given as to who did what when.
No.
Do you recall any discussion about why that was?
No. I don't think there was any discussion, I should say, rather than just no.
When the report was received,
Yes.
was there any discussion about its conclusions?
No.
Not that you were involved in or not at all?
No, I wasn't involved in any discussion about it.
And then if we turn to page 6, please, there's a heading 4.7, 2 questions remain unanswered from our review. Once the department was aware it would need to collect relevant documentation together, Dr. Raymond, who provided the secretariat role for the ACVSB and who had previous experience of non-party discovery, began the process of collecting information. This was in 1994. However, Dr. Raymond did not recall the ACVSB files from DRO, extracting information instead from other policy files. Some of the ACVSB files were still available unrecalled as late as 1997 and 1998, therefore. Dr. Raymond retired in 1994 as part of the FMR, and we don't know why the ACVSB files available at DRO were not recalled. And then the second bullet point, although volumes 14 to 17 were destroyed, volumes 1 to 3 survive, having been assigned lengthy review periods. For example, volumes 2 and 3 are due for second review in 2013 and 2014 respectively. These are the sort of review periods all volumes should have had, and it's not been possible to determine why volumes 1 to 3 were treated differently. Just in relation to the registered files not being recalled,
Yes.
is that something that, with the benefit of hindsight, you think you should have been addressing?
In 1994, perhaps. Addressing when I received the report.
Exactly.
No. Because I think they had gone.
And do you think you should have been recalling them in the 95, 96, 97 window when you were doing document disclosure?
Yes.
The report then sets out a series of recommendations in relation to induction and training.
Yes.
Did you have any involvement in their implementation?
No.
And I'm asked to ask you whether, to your knowledge, was anyone ever subject to any kind of disciplinary action as a result of the destruction of the ACVSB files?
No one was, no.
Sorry, sir. Final matter, Mrs. James.
Yes.
It's moving all the way forward to April 2002.
Yes.
There were a series of matters in the media about hepatitis C, and also where Lord Owen had said that his papers had been destroyed.
Yes.
That's the context for the document I want to go to.
Very well.
WITN 5426322. It's a minute from Mrs. Janet Walden to Charles Lister with UCC'd.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Just to confirm our discussion earlier this week, that I think it's important that you locate whatever papers are now in existence and ask someone fairly senior and experienced to put together a chronology of events and key background papers. Without that, it would be difficult to answer any accusations levelled against the department by Lord Owen and others. It may, of course, be the case that papers have been destroyed, in which case the exercise remains useful in that we can be open about being unable to accurately establish what exactly happened in the 1970s and 1980s. Whatever the outcome, we should be in a much better position to advise on whether or not a further investigation or inquiry is justified should there be continuing pressure to go down this route. This document might be read to suggest that the department in 2002 didn't have a set of documents collated that were the relevant papers, or a clear understanding of what decisions had been made in the 1970s and 80s. What would your response to that be?
Well, if we're talking specifically about Lord Owen's papers, then he was very concerned about the fact, as I understand it, that they had been destroyed.
Well, Mrs. James, this document appears to be somewhat broader than that,
Okay.
discussing a chronology of events and key documents.
I can't really answer your question, I'm afraid.
Something I was asked to ask you. So those are the questions I have for Mrs. James.
Yes, well, you've done exactly within your 10 minutes.
For once.
But allow me to take a couple extra, if I may.
Yes.
Just to ask you a couple of questions at this
Yes.
stage. You said in answer to counsel earlier, which led on to a discussion about corporate memory,
Yes.
that the person or persons who were involved in destroying the documents may not have appreciated the importance of them.
Yes.
And I just wanted to see what the context was. In January, 16th of January 1995, Panorama published an expose claiming that the government or the authorities hadn't taken appropriate action to take steps to prevent hepatitis C
Yes.
being transmitted by transfusion. That plainly was public. It would have come to the concern of the department, I have no doubt. And at 1994, we're told in the inquiry report that we've just been looking at, the department was on alert, as it were, that it might need to assemble documents.
Yes.
The department, in my understanding, that dealt with the relevant documents was likely to be a fairly small group.
Yes, you're right, in terms of numbers of staff.
And the view which was expressed to me yesterday
Yes.
was that if it's a small group, most people tend to know what's going on and what's important. Do you recall the Panorama programme and these concerns, and for that matter, the number of small individual actions which then began to surface against the department in respect of hepatitis C infection? Did they not put people on alert and make them think documents might be important? Does that feed into, does it inform your speculation as to whether people might not have appreciated the importance, or might it be that they did appreciate the importance? That's an issue for me.
I understand it's the issue for you, sir, but I think with the benefit of hindsight, one can say that. But at the time, I don't think anybody did give proper credence to their importance.
Thank you. Very well. Well, we'll take a break. Now, how long do you think you might need? Because you might need a little bit longer than usual if there are questions to be asked.
I wonder if we could return at, say, 2:20.
Let's say not before 2:20. The reason for putting it that way is that during the break, Council will be fielding questions from court participants
Yes.
through their legal representatives, which arise from the evidence which you've been giving.
Yes, I understand that, sir.
And I don't know how many questions there'll be. Maybe very few, maybe quite a lot. We'll come back and deal with those not before 2:20. If there are a lot in the pipeline, it may take a little bit longer, so you'll be told that there's a slight delay. But nothing to worry about, it'll take place soon.
I understand, thank you.
So, not before 2:20.